Hello, in this video I'm going to be answering the question of whether Egypt was a colony of Atlantis. Now, before we get into the presentation, the question, of course, is why ask this at all? And the reason we want to answer this question is, first of all, it's an interesting question. The idea that Egypt, which is already one of the most interesting and fascinating civilizations that we have that has ever existed, was itself a colony of an even greater civilization, is an interesting thought to begin with, because it suggests that our knowledge of Egypt is actually incomplete and that there is much more left to be learned about its true history. But the second reason why we want to actually attempt to answer this question is because this connection was actually explicitly made by one of the most important Atlantis researchers, actually probably the most important Atlantis researcher, except for Plato himself. That is Ignatius Donnelly. Ignatius Donnelly, as I said, is probably the most important Atlantis researcher other than Plato himself, and he wrote a book named Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882, in which he made several radical propositions at that time that went way beyond Plato's actual narratives. And there were 13 distinct claims in total, but three of the claims that are the most relevant to the possibility of Atlantis, of Egypt being a colony of Atlantis, are these three. And the one that is in bold is, of course, the most relevant. And Ignatius Donnelly himself explicitly asserts that the oldest colony formed by the Atlanteans was probably in Egypt, whose civilization was a reproduction of the Atlantic island. Let's see, presumably we can take Ignatius Donnelly at his word if he asserts this, but let's dig a little bit deeper and ask, is this assertion justified by Plato's actual dialogues, or does it reflect an imaginative mind that has read beyond the lines, so to speak? First of all, it's important to understand that in Plato's dialogues, Plato asserts that the earth was once divided between the gods, with the specific quote being, "In the days of old, the gods had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment. Now different gods had their allotments in different places which they set in order." From the Critias. And as for Atlantis, which was one of the allotments of one of the gods, namely Poseidon, this is stated in the Critias. And it's implied here that the gods were originally from elsewhere and that Atlantis was one of the places that they claimed and settled, because it seems to be a little bit questionable that one would be allotted a certain land that they were already from. It seems like this allotment process is only really necessary if you're distributing lands that you have just discovered and claimed instead of ones that you've already occupied. But that's really kind of going ahead of ourselves here. Let's continue to the next land of the next god that received it. Athens was allotted to two gods named Hephaestus and Athena. Athena you're probably familiar with, but Hephaestus is another god that is one of the Olympian gods, and there's 12 Olympian gods, and Hephaestus is just one of those gods. And Hephaestus and Athena, who are brothers and sisters, they both received as their common portion Athens. And as for Egypt, it turns out that this land was also allotted to Hephaestus and Athena too. And this Egyptian priest claims this, and this Egyptian priest says that, for example, "She founded your city 1,000 years before ours, receiving the earth from the earth and Hephaestus, the seed of your race, and afterwards she founded ours. The goddess who was the common patron and parent and educator of both our cities. So overall, the picture of the relationship of which gods received which lands and which gods were allotted which lands looks a little bit like this. You have the gods up here, and then one of the gods, Poseidon, receives as his land Atlantis. And then Athena and Hephaestus, two other gods, receive Athens and Egypt. And these lands are allotted to the same two gods and goddesses. Now, as for the question of whether Egypt was a colony of Atlantis, the real question that needs to be asked is as follows. The question that has to be asked is, where did the gods come from? Because if the gods were originally from Atlantis, as they are on the right-hand side, then that means that Poseidon is a god, and he is from Atlantis. Athena and Hephaestus are also from Atlantis, and hence the colonies in Egypt would be Atlantis, and hence Athens and Egypt would also be colonies of Atlantis. But in the case that the gods were originally not from Atlantis, then Athena and Hephaestus, they wouldn't be from Atlantis, and so Athens and Egypt in turn would not be colonized by people from by Atlantis. And likewise, Poseidon, who was not from Atlantis, would have been an outsider who colonized Atlantis. So the question of, as I said before, whether or not Athens and Egypt were colonies of Atlantis, that we can know whether the gods were originally from Atlantis. And it turns out that we have two contradictory narratives. In Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, it doesn't say explicitly, but it strongly implies that the gods were not indigenous to Atlantis, but were. It portrays Poseidon as falling in love and having intercourse with the daughter of an earthborn primeval man, and the daughter of that man is named Plato. So Poseidon came to this land, and the earthborn primeval man would have been the indigenous people of that land, and Poseidon would have been an outsider to that land. And so on this side, we have it's strongly implied that the gods were not originally from Atlantis, but were outsiders. But Diodorus Siculus' Library of History, which is another source that discusses Atlantis that is often overlooked by most Atlantis researchers who only focus on the dialogue of Plato. I have other videos explaining why the Library of History is an independent primary source of Atlantis. This source claims otherwise, and this source claims that the gods were born among them. So we have two contradictory sources as to whether the gods themselves were originally from Atlantis and native to it, or whether they were interlopers and outsiders who colonized Atlantis. With Plato saying that they were with Plato saying that Atlantis was colonized by the gods, and Diodorus saying that the gods originated in Atlantis. And so we have these two different perspectives. And if Diodorus Siculus is correct, and Athena and Hephaestus, two of the gods, are actually from Atlantis, Egypt, and settled them, would mean that Athens and Egypt were colonies of Atlantis. But if Plato is correct, then Hephaestus were not from Atlantis, and hence Athens and Egypt would not be colonies of Atlantis. And so Egypt would not be a colony of Atlantis. And so whether Ignatius Donnelly's claims of Egypt being a colony of Atlantis really depend on this subtle difference in interpretation between two texts. But because Plato's narratives and Plato's dialogues hold precedence because they are the more authoritative primary source, I think it's safe to say that it's certainly not clear as to whether Egypt was a colony of Atlantis, and that the real relationship between Egypt and Atlantis was that they were both colonies. In other words, Atlantis wasn't the mother country and Egypt wasn't a colony, but they were both colonies. But it just turned out that one of the colonies, Atlantis, ended up becoming much more powerful than the other. That is, for example, we have the United States, Australia, and Canada, which were all at one time colonies of Britain. But the United States became much more powerful. They were all colonies of the same so-called mother country. And so I think that's the relationship between Atlantis and Egypt that is described by Plato. That is, Atlantis and Egypt were both colonies, but that Atlantis just became much more powerful than the other colonies of the other colonies that were peopled by these gods who originally came from elsewhere.